Hello, I'm back. When we return, how the Church Fathers understood the Synoptic problem. Now, in approaching a nearly 2,000-year-old literary mystery such as this, probably the greatest literary mystery of all time, it's probably best to start at the beginning. Prior to the modern age, interpreters often, but not always, assume that Matthew was the first gospel. St. Augustine, in his work The Harmony of the Gospels, assumed Matthean priority, and somewhat contemptuously referred to Mark as a camp follower and abridger of Augustine. In Augustine's mind, Luke came after and then John. Now, other church fathers who dealt with the question, such as Clement of Alexandria, Eusebius, Jerome, seemed to agree with Augustine, if for no other reason than that the author of Matthew was assumed to be Matthew the tax collector, and therefore an eyewitness to the ministry of Jesus after he became a disciple, as it's recorded in Matthew chapter 9, verse 9. But on this issue, as with so many others, the consensus of the fathers turns out to be a bit chimerical. Jerome is one of several witnesses in antiquity to an ancient Hebrew version of the Gospel of Matthew, which is now lost, indeed, if it ever existed at all. It's this Hebrew Matthew to which Jerome assigned primacy. But if there was a Hebrew version of Matthew, it must have differed from the Greek version, which has been preserved for us. To nearly all accounts, the Gospel of Matthew, as we have it, is composition Greek and is not a translation from a Hebrew original. Now, Augustine knew also of this Hebrew Matthew, but still assumed that Mark abridged the Greek version of Matthew, the one that's in the Bible. Likewise, Clement of Alexandria also held Matthew to have been the earliest evangelist and held Mark to have written third, actually, after Luke and Matthew. But Clement does not seem to think, as Augustine did, that Mark abridged Matthew. Rather, he held that Mark based his gospel on the preaching of Peter. But it's difficult to see how both Augustine and Clement could be exactly correct. After all, if Mark based his gospel on the preaching of Peter, as Clement thought, it would have been sort of superfluous and unnecessary for him to have abridged Matthew, as Augustine thought. And if he abridged Matthew, it's hard to see why he also would have needed the preaching of Peter. More likely, Clement is trying to harmonize divergent traditions about Mark and Matthew, while Augustine is trying to harmonize the traditional belief in Matthean priority with a sensible acknowledgement of the literary interdependence of Matthew and Mark, which Clement lacks. But in this, Augustine is quietly setting aside the other tradition about Mark's dependence, principally not on Matthew, but on the preaching of Peter. Both Augustine and Clement were assuming that Matthew was a member of the 12, writing as an eyewitness. They're both two important witnesses, therefore, to the unanimous belief of the early church concerning the identity of the first Gospel's author. Now, absent of very strong evidence for another author, I think we should be very reluctant to abandon that tradition. On the other hand, we need to be a little bit careful here and be wary of over-interpreting the significance of Matthew as the author of the gospel that bears his name. We shouldn't suppose that the material in his gospel largely reflects the first-hand account of an eyewitness. Well, why not? Well, it is true that there are at least some elements unique to Matthew's gospel that could, in theory, reflect a personal reminiscence. Now, think of the story of Peter walking on water in Matthew 14:33, or Peter getting the keys in Matthew 16:16, or Peter and the fish coin story in Matthew 17:24. Or for that matter, the disciples as a whole being given the power to bind and loose in Matthew 18:18. Now clearly Matthew was nearby and could have witnessed each of these things and later written them down. We should be certainly open to that possibility that Matthew contributed these stories. Now, other stories in Matthew, at least in theory, could also have been recalled by Matthew the tax collector himself. But there's a but coming here. If you think about it a little more, positing Matthew as an eyewitness does not get us too far in accounting for much of what his gospel contains. When we look at the infancy narratives, Matthew 1 and 2, the long chapters, the baptism of the Lord, the temptation of Jesus in the wilderness, the calling of the disciples from careers as Galilean fishermen. Now, one realized that Matthew is actually quite capable of writing stories of things that he did not personally eyewitness. Matthew fled from Gethsemane at the arrest of the Lord. He tells us this. Therefore, he seemed ill-positioned to witness the passion of Jesus personally, and yet he narrates it quite brilliantly all the same, with tidbits that are unique to his gospel, such as Pilate's wife dream and the grisly suicide of Judas Iscariot. These are elements unique to Matthew. Similarly, Matthew's transfiguration agrees in the basic framework, with minor differences with Mark's and Luke's. Yet here again, this was a private encounter of the Lord Jesus with Peter, James, and John. Matthew didn't write that one as an eyewitness. So where did that story come from? Well, wherever it came from, the story that Matthew tells us is remarkably like the story that the other two non-eyewitnesses, Mark and Luke, tell us. Matthew is perfectly capable of narrating and indeed altering accounts that must have originally come to him secondhand. So what I want you to see at the outset is that belief in Matthew's as the eyewitness doesn't really satisfactorily explain where his gospel came from, and nor does it really satisfactorily explain, for that matter, the many similarities between his gospel and his two synoptic brethren, Mark and Luke. Approaching his gospel, as many of the church fathers did, with the a priori assumption that is derived from the first-hand information is one thing, but based on a careful examination of the data of Matthew itself, his gospel doesn't look any more like an eyewitness's account than do Mark or Luke, who are putatively non-eyewitnesses. The prima facie evidence is that Matthew's gospel's writing process didn't really differ significantly from the process that Mark or Luke followed. And there's another important witness to the character of Matthew's gospel in the person of Saint Papias, who wrote in the early 2nd century AD. Now, his work, The Expositions of the Oracles of the Lord, currently survives only in the smattering of citation found mostly in Irenaeus and Eusebius of Caesarea. Now, hopefully one day this work will be recovered in its entirety. Maybe it's hiding in a library somewhere, because its early character by a man who knew those who knew the apostolic inner circle might shed light on many of the mysteries that are still out there about gospel origins. But here the relevant portions of Papias, as cited by Eusebius and Mark and Matthew, are worth considering. Quote, "This also the presbyter said. Mark, having become the interpreter of Peter, wrote down accurately, though not in order, whatsoever he remembered of the things said or done by Christ. For he neither heard the Lord nor followed him, but afterward, as I said, he followed Peter, who adapted his teachings to the needs of his hearers, but with no intention of giving a connected account of the Lord's discourses, so that Mark committed no error, while thus he wrote some of the things as he remembered them. For he was careful of one thing, not to omit any of the things which he had heard, and not to state any of them falsely." Okay, end inner quote, and then Eusebius goes on to say these things are related by Papias concerning Mark. But concerning Matthew, he writes as follows, quote, now Eusebius is quoting Papias again, "So then Matthew wrote the logia of the Lord in the Hebrew language," or dialect, "and everyone interpreted them as he was able," end quote. Now, what's curious here is that Papias, as Eusebius cites him, echoes the tradition about the Hebrew version of Matthew. The term he uses for language might have the force of dialect, in which case he might actually be referring to Aramaic rather than Hebrew. Also of note is the term logia for what Matthew wrote. Now, the normal sense of logia is oracles or sayings, but it could also refer to things as well. Now, some people look at Papias' witness to Matthew and argue that he believes in Matthean priority too because of the Hebrew dialect and the logia. But I think that three factors actually tell against this. First, notice that Matthew is listed second to Mark by Papias, which is really odd if Papias thought that Matthew was the first gospel writer. Second, notice that the same kind of accuracy one might have associated with a first-hand account of a member of Jesus' inner circle is being claimed not for Matthew, but for Mark on the basis of his dependence on the preaching of Peter. Third, it is of note also that Papias, again as Eusebius cites him, is silent on the exact issue of who wrote first. But Eusebius himself cited Clement of Alexandria approvingly for his view that Mark wrote after both Matthew and Luke. Now, a strong inference is that Eusebius himself thought that Matthew was the first evangelist, and would surely have told us this if Papias had thought so too. So it is either the case that Papias had no opinion at all on the synoptic problem of who wrote first, or that he had an opinion that was different than Eusebius's, which Eusebius has suppressed, as he's been known to do with other sources on other occasions. Now, I've suggested above Papias' view that Mark wrote Peter's own preached accounts of the tradition of Jesus doesn't fit that easily with the view of Augustine. Okay, so we've seen that some fathers believe Matthew wrote first, but they're divided as to whether this was an earlier Hebrew version of Matthew or the canonical version of Matthew that we find in the Bible. Now, while it is arguable now that Papias believed that Mark wrote first, basing his stories on the preaching of Peter. So actually, amidst all this variety of views, there was actually another view of the Gospels in antiquity that was based on a de facto view of John being the first Gospel, as well as on the view that the four Gospels could be harmonized into one Gospel. Now, the most famous and widely accepted attempt at this Gospel harmonization was the Diatessaron of Tatian, and this dates back to around the 2nd century. Tatian basically fitted Matthew, Mark, and Luke into the Johannine chronological framework, and for this reason John took a certain priority, if not in composition, but in the way most interpreters imagine the historical ministry of Jesus. Most later attempts at harmonizing the Gospels assumed the 3-year time frame found in John, and that's a tendency which persists into the modern era, in fact, well beyond the time of the Reformers. So, what should be acknowledged here at this stage is that simply appealing to tradition to solve an historical question like the synoptic problem is really an unsatisfactory way of solving the issue. Especially given that the voices of tradition each had somewhat different approaches to the problem. What's going to be needed here is a more systematic approach to the problem. And how that systematic approach happened, well, we'll discuss that in our next video.